Hello and welcome to our penultimate book, which I have optimistically titled Modiano Summing Up. But it would be the man or lead woman in this case who would be able to sum up Modiano. However, I did point you in the direction of his Nobel Prize session, where I think he gives as good a summing up as anyone is likely to do. Well, Suspended Sentences, well, three novellas. I found it really a fascinating book to get to grips with, and I was really pleased that so many of you seemed to find it equally fascinating, or if you didn't tell me. It's quite a challenge to the reader, and it's interesting why he is such a popular writer, because in many ways he is really not very accessible at all. And I think you have to retune your expectations as reader in a way, because reading Modiano is a different kind of reading experience. Particularly if we could compare, we could say what sort of book, and it's really hard to say what sort of book. Clearly, if we look at the other books we've looked at on our course so far, it's really very different. But there are some very interesting parallels, I think, particularly with the last book, the Simone de Beauvoir, which, of course, was written during the occupation and was finally published in 1945, which was the very year in which Patrick Modiano was born, although you would never think so, because he is completely obsessed by the years before he was born, and this is what he is obsessively writing about all the time, trying to piece together his memories, as it were, or his lack of memories in many cases. So his motivation to write, I think I gave you a nice quote about that, didn't I? He says, "I wrote to try and understand who I am, to find an identity for myself." His writing is all part of his quest for his identity, his search through his memories. And one of the interesting things, of course, about his books is the way in which he blurs the line between fact and fiction. The three ones we've read all have a first-person narrator. Now, is this narrator Patrick Modiano? Are the experiences really what happened to him? Well, I think they are and they aren't. Essentially, from what we know of his life, he is always picking and unpicking away at these fragile memories. Briefly, he had a very unsettled childhood. I think that central novella, the Remise de Peine, Suspended Sentences, probably gives us a pretty good picture of what it was like. His mother was an actress. His father was a dubious character, a black market racketeer by all accounts, also Jewish. But Patrick Modiano did not find out this salient fact, this identifying fact in a way, until he himself was an adolescent. So his father is the big mystery figure in a way, and he is kind of at the center of many of these trawls back through memory, trying to piece things together. So just to pick up, let's think on the title of our course, Literature and Cities. How is Paris described in these books? Which really the first and the last, because Paris doesn't feature so much in the middle story. Paris is melancholic, nostalgic. The quartier he describes are often on the outskirts, as it were. He returns again and again to the périphérique, and how when this was built huge areas of Paris that were demolished. So these were like his memories in a way. And this word périphérique is kind of important too, because so many of the characters that he goes in quest of are on the periphery, as it were. They are marginal, but somehow they might hold the clue to what he's looking for. But when he goes back, he says he's almost as he's like a tourist, as it were, because it's always the Paris of the past that he's talking about. This kind of vanishing world, which he often likens to old films, and we have these other metaphors like dead leaves or clogging the streets, etc., etc. The only time stands still when he is with his brother, and of course we know that his brother tragically died when he was only 9, but his brother is reality for Modiano, and that's very powerful little description when the two little boys are, well, I don't know how little they were, but small boys were playing in some rock ground near the Louvre, as it were, and he says their time stands still. That's time that's kind of crystallized, as it were. In many ways, I gave you a quote, I think, from one of the critics saying all his novels resemble crime stories. Well, they do. They're a series of investigations, but of course, in crime stories, you normally get the answer at the end. This is detective work that never quite gets an answer, and I think the narrator knows this in a way. He is always pushing something forward, and then it doesn't resolve. It doesn't resolve. There's a parallel, I think, to the two little boys in the middle story, Remise de Pain, when they sort of dare each other to go to this chateau, but they never quite get there. It remains in their imagination. So this, the understanding is always elusive. It will always be an enigma, as it were. In his Nobel Prize speech, he made some rather interesting comments, I think, about 19th century literature. He mentions other writers who wrote about the cities, Balzac and Dickens and Dostoevsky, for example. And I quote, he talks about time. In those days, time passed more slowly than today, and this slowness suited the world of the novelist because it allowed him to marshal his energy and his attention. Time has speeded up since then and moves forward in fits and starts, explaining the difference between the towering literary edifices of the past and the disjointed and fragmented works of today. And of course, he could be describing his own work here, the disjointed and fragmented works. And in another part of that same speech, he talks about Proust and how Proust, in his famous À la Recherche, etc., is able to recapture lost time. And he says, interestingly, I do not think that the remembrance of things past can be done any longer with Proust's power and candidness. The society he was describing was still stable. Proust's memory causes the past to reappear in all its detail like a tableau vivant. Today, I get the sense that memory is much less sure of itself, engaged as it is in a constant struggle against amnesia and oblivion. And this quest to reconstruct the past is, of course, bound up very much with a kind of French historical memory, the collective French historical memory about the Années Noires, the years of the occupation. And it's these that, in a way, he wants to, let's say, bring to mind. Yes, possibly. He feels that these have been whitewashed, as it were. They are in danger of sinking into oblivion. This is why he's continually trying to piece together years when he wasn't even alive and people who who he's never met. It's a way of reconstructing the past, but he can only do it in this kind of disjointed, fragmentary way, which is why we get these shifts of tense, why we get these pursuits which never really seem to resolve very much. Briefly about the three stories. The first one is about the photographer, Frederick Janssen. And the image of photos is, again, quite a powerful metaphor in a way, catching these fragmentary moments. And at one point he says, "I am Frederick Janssen," but he gives a picture of himself as a young man trying to catalogue these images of a reality which has already vanished. So it's in many ways kind of a metaphor of what he's doing in his writing. The middle story is the one that everyone liked best, and it gives a very interesting picture, I think, of childhood. The children not understanding they've been dumped by their parents, and they are in a situation where they're being looked after by adults who they really don't know, but who are actually quite kind to them. But they're also rather sinister. We learn at a later point that most of these adults ended up in prison. But there is a very strong fairy tale element to this whole section. One of the adults they called Snow White, and then Mathilde, the older woman, is described as a rather witch-like character. And then, of course, there's the enchanted castle, the chateau, that they never really get there. And they get surprise gifts, the gifts of the dodging car. People come and go without explanation. And there is a whole adult world from which they cannot understand at all. I mean, from time to time, they want to know what's going on. People say, well, something serious, something serious. And then at the end, a sad picture, there's just these, they come back to the house, they see the car being towed away. And the last sentence I read, "My brother and I, we pretended to play in the garden, waiting for someone to come and collect us." We don't know if anyone ever does. The last novella, Flowers of Ruin, is, to my mind, the least satisfactory. It's very hard to follow the thread at all, because he is perpetually kind of going off at tangents. Normally, he's in quest of this character, Pacheco, whose identity is very much in question. It's a sort of enigma posed by someone who he says, an enigma posed by a man I had no chance of finding again. Why had he left me his suitcase, he asks. Did he want to teach me a lesson, show me that reality was more elusive than I thought? Well, if he wanted to teach him that lesson, it's clearly a lesson that Modiano has learned very well. But just to conclude, in the very good introduction to the edition, I think we've all got, the Yale University Press one, the translator says, "The inconclusiveness of the pursuit is central to the story, indeed is the story." Yes, I think there's actually a strong parallel here with our experience as readers of Modiano. As we read these texts, we are trying to piece together the evidence in the same way that he does. We're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to, what does this mean? Knowing in a sense that we're not going to get there. And this, I think, is the sort of the enigma at the heart of what Modiano is doing. But it's in his writing that he creates an identity, and it's in his writing that he also constructs a meaning. Right, well, next time, our last book, and again, something completely different.